about how muscles generate their ATP and how the source of ATP differs with different types of muscle, but also with different types of activity. Okay? And on that basis, we'll discuss specific examples of fiber types and where they're located in the body. So the first thing we want to understand is that ATP is needed for muscle to do work. Right? This is a constant. We looked at this phenomenon when we talked about the phosphate cycle. It's going to be required for different types of work in different sources or different methods. Now, it's specifically needed to drive the phosphate cycle. Can anyone remind us specifically where ATP is needed during the phosphate cycle? Where is ATP required, or what is it doing in the phosphate cycle? How does it drive muscle contraction? Perfect. It binds to the myosin head. It's going to energize the myosin head when it's hydrolyzed, and that is going to drive the power stroke. Okay, that's going to bring the shortening of the sarcomere, bring the shortening of the entire muscle belly, and bring about muscle contraction. So now we know that ATP is required, and now we know exactly, we reminded ourselves exactly what it's doing in muscle, right, to drive that process. Let's look at the sources of ATP. Where do we get that ATP from? Now, there are three general sources of ATP for muscle contraction, and the first or the second two, we just reminded ourselves of. We just talked about oxidative phosphorylation, happens in the mitochondria, and then we reminded ourselves about the features of anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, and let's just point out where those are actually occurring in this diagram. So we know that anaerobic glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose happening out in the cytosol. Now we're going to generate pyruvate at the end of glycolysis. And I want you to understand at this point that because we're generating pyruvate and because this is a faster process, we're not able to break down all of that pyruvate immediately. And so it starts to build up. And as it builds up, what is it converted to? What is all that excess pyruvate converted to? Citric acid, close. Come on, not too far. So it's an acid, lactic acid, right? Lactate or lactic acid. So that excess pyruvate that we're now building up by breaking down glucose is going to be converted. You can see the double arrows this way, converted to lactate. And we'll talk more about that later on, but just bear that in mind. The other process, oxidative phosphorylation, what do we know about this process? First of all, it's requiring oxygen. It's heavily reliant on oxygen. Secondly, it's taking place in the what organelle? Mitochondria. Good. It's taking place in the mitochondria. And thirdly, it's giving us much more ATP than glycolysis can. So those are the two main sources of ATP for muscle. And a muscle tissue can tap into either one of those sources predominantly, depending on its use, depending on the activity that's being done. Now, the first source that's listed here, phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate, this is what we're going to discuss next, and this is a transient source of ATP. Okay? Now, when I say transient source, this means that this is not the major source of muscle contraction, but we generate ATP using the creatine phosphate system as a way to energize muscle while the other two main metabolic processes are getting warmed up or getting geared up. Okay, so I'll say that again. When muscle starts to contract, there's not a readily available source of ATP until those two major metabolic processes have gotten time to warm up. And so during that transient period, we have to rely on the creatine phosphate system to give us a small amount of ATP in that brief transient period. Okay, so this has to be quick. It takes usually less than a minute for us to tap into those ATP stores and to energize muscle until those processes get warmed up. And so what we have here is this reaction that represents that process. So we have creatine phosphate on the left, and we have ADP on the left. Now, the enzyme involved here is creatine kinase. And then the products are going to be creatine or ATP, creatine and ATP. And so the double-headed arrows, the equilibrium arrows, are telling us that this reaction can proceed in either direction. It can go to the left, where we produce more creatine phosphate and ADP, or it can go to the right, where we produce more creatine and ATP. Now, what do you think is going on in the muscle when we require ATP? What's happening in the muscle when we require ATP? What's happening in the muscle when ATP starts to get depleted? It's contracting, right? So the muscle starts contracting, and because we have limited ATP here, we don't have those processes going just yet, we start to build up ADP, right? So remember, remind yourself that during the phosphate cycling, the myosin head is going to bring about the power stroke, and then it's going to kick off that ADP. So as that level of ADP rises, what do we need to do? What's the signal? ADP is rising. What's the signal? Which direction do we drive this reaction? We have lots of ADP. To the right, right? We're building up our substrate on the left, which is ADP. We have existing creatine phosphate in the muscle, and so using creatine kinase will drive this reaction to the right, and that's going to help replenish the ATP to get the muscle contracting. Okay. Now let's say you've contracted muscle, you've gotten those processes, you've gotten the ATP to the muscle in that transient period, and now those major metabolic processes have taken over, and we have sufficient ATP. Now, where do you think the reaction will be driven in this case? We're going to drive it to the left. Now we have excess ATP, right? Those two main processes have taken over generating ATP. And so we have excess of that substrate, and we now drive this reaction back to the left. And we create additional creatine phosphate that's going to be just sitting there waiting for the next time we need this system. And that's what we mean by saying on tap. So on tap means that if we have excess ATP, we drive this reaction to the left, and we replenish the creatine phosphate, and that's going to be sitting waiting for the next time we need to tap into this transient source of energy. Okay, and in such a way, the creatine phosphate system is shifting that phosphate from ADP to make ATP back to creatine to make creatine phosphate. It's going back and forth, depending on the metabolic needs of the muscle and whether or not those other processes have kicked in. Any questions on this system? Any questions on this? Okay, so this is that first source of energy. Now, let's talk more about how the two major metabolic processes, how we tap into one or the other depending on the intensity of the exercise. So let's say we're walking or jogging. This is considered light to moderate intensity exercise. And so during these types of activities, we can usually maintain oxygenation. Right? If you're walking or if you're jogging, you can usually continuously maintain your ventilation. You can keep air coming in. And so you're going to really rely heavily on oxidative phosphorylation. Remember, we said oxidative phosphorylation requires oxygen. Okay? But during the initial period of muscle contraction with this type of exercise, we typically tap into our glycogen stores first. And this makes sense. This is more efficient for the body. If you already have some glycogen stored in your muscle, remember, glycogen is the storage form of glucose. We tap into that glycogen, we break it down using anaerobic glycolysis, and we can use that to form ATP initially, right? It's more efficient if we already have it stored. Now, up to 30 minutes, we can also tap into any glucose that's in the blood, and we can tap into any fatty acids that are being broken down as well. Okay, I'll say this again. It's more efficient for the body to tap into stores that are existing. If you've had a large meal, you're in a well-fed state, you've got glucose in your blood, you can tap into those stores easily and generating new ATP with one of those major metabolic processes. So up to 30 minutes of light intensity exercise, light to moderate, you can generate ATP using your glycogen stores, using any glucose or fatty acids that are in your blood. Okay? Now, we want to remind ourselves that in order to uptake glucose, we need to do what in terms of bringing that glucose into the cells? How do we bring glucose into our cells? How do we bring glucose into our cells? We spoke about transport way back at the beginning of the semester, so this should be a review. How do we increase the amount of glucose that's being uptaken into our cells? Oh, my line. It's not active, it's facilitated, but it requires the carrier protein. Not more surface area. So we insert these root 4 carrier proteins into the membrane. You remember that? So inserting of the root 4 transporters into the membrane, into the sarcolemma of the muscle, will increase how much glucose the muscle can take up. And in order to rely on anaerobic glycolysis, we have to be able to get glucose into the muscle, and so we increase the expression of these receptors on the membrane. Okay, so that's going to be heavily important in this type of intensity exercise. The other thing that's important is maintaining ventilation. Why do we have to maintain ventilation here? To get oxygen. Perfect. This process is heavily reliant on oxygen. If we cannot maintain oxygenation, we cannot conduct oxidative phosphorylation. So increasing your ventilation, maintaining that ventilation, increasing your heart rate and the contractility of your heart, so how fast your heart is pumping to deliver oxygen to these tissues, as well as dilating blood vessels to help, again, deliver that oxygen to the tissues, are going to be important factors with this type of metabolic process. Okay? And if you look at the details of this graph, we'll see that in the initial stages here, within the first minute, we're tapping into that transient source that we spoke about, the creatine phosphate system. That doesn't last very long. That's about a minute, the first minute of muscle contraction. And then we start switching over to anaerobic glycolysis briefly. And the only reason we do this, again, is because it's more efficient. We're tapping into glycogen that's already in storage. And then the major metabolic process that really takes over after about the second or third minute is oxidative phosphorylation, which is heavily reliant on oxygen. Okay? And so this is how muscle is energized for light to moderate intensity exercise. Let's look at heavier intensity exercise. So let's say you're sprinting, let's say you're running, let's say you're lifting heavy weights. You're not going to be able to maintain ventilation, right? If you're sprinting, you certainly can't maintain ventilation, and so you deplete oxygen. And as a result of depleting oxygen, anaerobic glycolysis is going to drop off. Oxidative phosphorylation is going to drop off. That's reliant on oxygen. And anaerobic glycolysis is going to take over. Okay, so the major metabolic process that drives heavy intensity exercise is anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, now what is the price to pay with anaerobic glycolysis? What's the drawback here? Okay, so we got less ATP, that's one drawback. What's another drawback here? What's another price to pay? It's not sustainable. Why? It's going to fatigue pretty quickly, but why? It has to do with the buildup of lactic acid. Perfect. So we already saw this before. Anaerobic glycolysis is going to give us less ATP. It's going to be quicker in terms of generating ATP, but it's going to come at a price. It's going to come at the cost of building up lactic acid in the muscle, and that's what gives you that burn. If you've ever been doing some heavy intensity exercise, if you're sprinting, if you're lifting really heavy weights, you can feel that burn in your muscle, and that's the price to pay of using anaerobic glycolysis. Okay? And as you mentioned before, significantly less ATP is generated here, only 2 molecules net per molecule of glucose. So let's look at the details of this graph here again. So again, we see creatine phosphate as the main source during the initial period of muscle contraction. But then what we see is oxidative phosphorylation drop off as ventilation drops off. And then anaerobic glycolysis takes over completely as the main source of ATP to fuel heavy